Let's start with something most people completely misunderstand about avoidant dynamics. When an avoidant pulls away, the instinct of almost every emotionally invested person is to close the distance immediately, to text more, explain more, reassure more, ask more questions, try harder, fix faster. It feels like love, but psychologically it often reads as pressure. And pressure is exactly what an avoidant nervous system is wired to reject. Now here's where the first shift happens in you, the one that changes everything. You didn't chase their emotional distance. You respected it. That sounds simple, but it's actually a very advanced emotional state. Because to respect distance when you feel uncertainty, confusion, or emotional discomfort requires something most people don't have in that moment: self-regulation. Think about what usually happens in relationships where attachment anxiety is high. One person pulls away even slightly and the other person interprets that space as danger, not inconvenience danger. The nervous system starts to escalate. Something is wrong. I need to fix this. I need to get them back. And in that state, love becomes pursuit. But pursuit in the eyes of an avoidant doesn't feel like connection. It feels like intrusion. So what did you do differently? You paused the automatic reaction. You didn't turn their silence into a crisis. You didn't convert their need for space into your need for reassurance. Instead, you allowed the space to exist without trying to collapse it. And here's the deeper psychological layer most people miss. When you don't chase, you interrupt the avoidance expected pattern. Avoidants are often conditioned by past experiences where closeness escalates into emotional demand, pressure, or loss of autonomy. So when they pull away, they unconsciously anticipate a reaction. They expect pursuit, emotional intensity, or attempts to pull them back into closeness before they're ready. But when that doesn't happen, when instead they encounter calm, grounded absence of pursuit, it creates cognitive dissonance. Their internal model of relationships no longer matches reality. And that disruption is powerful. Because now, for the first time, distance doesn't produce chaos on the other side. It produces stability. And stability in the psychological world of an avoidant is rare. This is where something subtle begins to form. They don't immediately run back. That's not how avoidance systems work. But they start to register something different about you. You are not escalating their nervous system. You are not attaching panic to their space. You are not making their autonomy feel threatened. You are allowing them to breathe without consequence. And that changes the emotional equation entirely. From a neurobiological perspective, attachment isn't just about closeness. It's about whether closeness feels safe. And safety is not built through intensity, it's built through consistency without pressure. When you don't chase, you signal something deeper than interest. You signal emotional control. You signal self-possession. You signal that your emotional state is not dependent on their immediate response. That is not indifference. That is regulation. And here's the paradox. The very thing that most people think will create distance-giving spaces, often what creates the first genuine sense of attachment for someone avoidant. Because now they can move away and still feel you exist as something steady, not collapsing, not reacting, not demanding. You become, in their internal experience, emotionally non-threatening. G. And non-threat is the foundation of curiosity. Curiosity is the foundation of re-engagement. And re-engagement is where attachment begins to form in a way that feels voluntary rather than forced. But perhaps the most important part of this is what it did to you. Because when you stop chasing, you are not just changing their experience of you, you are changing your relationship with yourself. You are no longer outsourcing your emotional stability to someone else's availability. You are no longer negotiating your worth in real time based on someone's attention or withdrawal. You are standing still while they move. And that position, emotionally grounded, self-contained, non-reactive, is incredibly powerful. Not because it manipulates them, but because it liberates you. And in relationships with avoidance, that is the turning point most people never reach. You didn't chase their distance. You respected it. And in that respect, you did something far more influential than pursuit ever could. You created space where love could feel safe enough to return on its own. Because sometimes the strongest form of love is not the one that runs after someone. It's the one that proves it can remain and whole even when they walk away. Now let's go deeper into something even more revealing about why avoidant dynamics shift in your favor. You stayed regulated when they went cold. And if you really understand attachment psychology, you know this is where most relationships either collapse or transform. Because when an avoidant deactivates, when they suddenly become distant, less responsive, emotionally flat, or even slightly indifferent, it doesn't just affect the relationship. It activates the other person's nervous system. It creates a spike, a kind of internal alarm that says, I'm losing them. And in that moment, most people stop relating and start reacting. They send the long message. They ask for clarity. They push for emotional accountability. They try to reestablish connection through intensity. But here's the paradox. Intensity is exactly what the avoidance system is built to shut down. So what happens next is a predictable cycle. One person escalates, the other withdraws further. One pursues harder, the other distances more. And what could have been a moment of temporary emotional regulation becomes a full activation of the attachment wound on both sides. But you didn't do that. You stayed regulated. That doesn't mean you didn't feel anything. That's a misunderstanding people often make. Regulation is not emotional numbness. It's emotional leadership. It means you felt the activation, but you didn't let it drive your behavior. You observed the distance without collapsing into it. And that is psychologically powerful because it breaks a pattern most avoidants are deeply accustomed to. Avoidants often develop their emotional strategy early in life. When things get intense, withdraw. When things feel demanding, create space. When emotions become unpredictable, reduce exposure. It's not about lack of feeling, it's about managing overwhelm. So when they pull away in adult relationships, they are not just creating distance from you. They are returning to a familiar regulation strategy. Now imagine what happens when for the first time that strategy is met with something different. No pursuit, no panic, no emotional escalation, just steadiness. You didn't become louder when they became quieter. You didn't become anxious when they became distant. You didn't try to pull them back into emotional intensity just to soothe your own discomfort. You stayed composed. The resonance thread D, and that composure does something very specific to the avoidant nervous system. It interrupts prediction because their internal model says, if I withdraw, the other person will react. But instead they encounter calm. And calm is not something their system is used to interpreting as safety and relational distance. It creates a new reference point. This is where emotional recalibration begins. Not because you forced it, but because you didn't interfere with their withdrawal process with panic-based behavior. And here's the deeper philosophical layer. Emotional regulation in moments of relational uncertainty is not just a relational skill, it's a form of self-trust. Because what you are really saying in that moment without words is, I can tolerate uncertainty without abandoning myself. That is the core difference between emotional dependence and emotional maturity. And avoidants, even though they may not articulate it consciously, are deeply sensitive to this quality. Because underneath their avoidance is often a fear of being engulfed by someone who cannot regulate themselves when closeness is disrupted. So when you remain steady while they go cold, something unexpected happens, ends internally. You stop being categorized as pressure and start being registered as safe proximity. Not immediate closeness, not forced intimacy, but safe presence. And that distinction matters. Because safe presence is what allows an avoidant to reapproach on their own terms, without feeling controlled, without feeling trapped, without feeling emotionally obligated. But there is another layer here that is just as important. While you are regulating the external dynamic, you are also regulating your internal identity. You are no longer defining your worth by real-time access to them. You are no longer letting their emotional state dictate your emotional reality. You are no longer turning silence into rejection or distance into abandonment. You are staying anchored in yourself. And that changes everything about the relational field between two people. Because the moment you stop reacting, you stop feeding the cycle. And when the cycle stops feeding itself, something new becomes possible. Clarity. Not forced clarity. Not emotional interrogation. Real clarity that emerges from stillness. And in that stillness, the avoidant starts to experience something unfamiliar in relation. 3 is ships with you. Emotional space that does not collapse under pressure. That experience is rare. And rarity creates attention. And attention, when it is not driven by anxiety or pursuit, slowly becomes attachment. You stayed regulated when they went cold. And in doing so, you didn't just protect yourself from emotional chaos, you created the only environment where real connection could begin to grow without fear of suffocation. Now let's look at something that quietly shifts the entire power dynamic in these relationships. You didn't compete for their attention, you maintained your own life. At first glance, that might sound simple, almost obvious. But psychologically, this is one of the most difficult behaviors to sustain when you're emotionally invested in someone who is inconsistent. Because when someone becomes unpredictable, warm one moment, distant the next, the nervous system naturally tries to solve the instability by increasing focus on the source of it. In other words, your world starts to narrow, your thoughts revolve around them, your emotional state begins to track their availability. Your attention becomes reactive instead of intentional. And without realizing it, the three-a relationship becomes the central axis of your internal experience. But you didn't let that happen. You didn't turn them into the center of your identity. And that changes everything. Because avoidant attachment is not just about fear of closeness. It's also about sensitivity to dependency. On a deep psychological level, avoidants are often highly attuned to any signal that someone is starting to rely on them for emotional regulation. Not because they don't care, but because dependency in their internal model equals pressure. So when someone begins to orbit them emotionally, checking, waiting, adjusting, prioritizing them above everything else, the avoidance system begins to feel burdened. Even if there is love present, but you didn't create that burden. You stayed anchored in your own life. That means while they were fluctuating in presence, you were consistent in purpose. While they were deciding how close to get, you were still building your own direction. While they were emotionally inconsistent, you remained structurally consistent. And that creates a very specific psychological signal. You are not a gap that needs to be filled, you are a complete system that exists independently. Their participation. This is where attraction begins to shift in a very subtle but powerful way. Because human psychology is drawn to what is stable but not consumed. We are wired to notice individuals who are engaged with life beyond the relationship itself. There is something inherently compelling about someone who is not waiting for permission to live. And in avoidant dynamics specifically, this becomes even more amplified. Because what they often expect consciously or unconsciously is that emotional closeness will lead to relational centrality. That the relationship will become all-consuming for the other person. That space for individuality will shrink over time. But instead, they encounter something different in you. You are present but not absorbed. Interested but not dependent. Connected but not consumed. And that creates a kind of psychological relief they may not even be able to articulate. Because suddenly they don't feel responsible for your entire emotional ecosystem. They don't feel like they have to manage your stability. They don't feel like your life collapses when they step back. You are still standing. And that changes the emotional meaning of your connection. Tion. But there's something even deeper happening underneath this. When you maintain your own life, you are sending a signal not just to them, but to yourself. You are reinforcing your own identity outside of relational validation. You are proving to your nervous system that connection does not require self-abandonment. And that internal alignment is what creates real attractiveness, not performative independence, but actual grounded self-direction. Because people don't fall in love with those who orbit them. They are drawn to those who have gravity of their own. And gravity doesn't chase, it pulls. So while others may have tried to increase their presence in order to secure attention, you did something far more powerful. You increased the strength of your own center of gravity. You didn't compete for attention. You became someone whose attention had value because it was not freely given out of lack, but shared from abundance. And that distinction is everything. Because in the psychology of avoidant attraction, there is a quiet realization that begins to form over time. This person is not waiting for me to complete them. This person is already living. And I am not the source of their present stability, I am an addition to it. That realization removes pressure. And where pressure disappears, curiosity begins. And where curiosity begins, emotional re-engagement becomes possible without fear. You didn't compete for their attention. You maintained your own life. And in doing so, you didn't just become more attractive to them, you became undeniable to yourself. Now let's go into something that separates emotional chaos from emotional mastery in these dynamics. You were consistent without being controlling. And that combination is far more powerful than most people realize, because consistency alone can still become pressure if it's attached to demands, expectations, or emotional enforcement. But when consistency is paired with freedom, when it shows up without control, it creates something psychologically rare. Safe predictability. Think about what most people do when they feel uncertainty in a relationship. They try to stabilize it through control. They increase check-ins. They ask for reassurance. They set emotional rules. They try to define behavior in order to reduce unpredictability. But here's the paradox. The more control you introduce into an emotionally avoidant dynamic, the more resistance you create. Because avoidant individuals are extremely sensitive to perceived emotional constraint, even subtle forms of it. Not because they don't value connection, but because they equate control with loss of autonomy. And autonomy is their psychological anchor. So when you removed control from your consistency, you changed the entire emotional environment. You didn't disappear, but you didn't demand either. You didn't become unpredictable, but you didn't become restrictive. You showed up in a way that said, I am here, but I am not here to manage you. And that is a very specific emotional signal. It communicates reliability without entrapment, presence without pressure, connection without conditions being constantly enforced. Now here's where it gets interesting from a psychological standpoint. The human nervous system is constantly scanning for patterns, especially in relationships. It's trying to answer a simple question. What happens when I get close to this person? And what happens when I pull away? In many relationships, especially those involving anxious avoidant dynamics, the answer becomes unstable. Closeness triggers pressure. Distance triggers. 3, a pursuit. The system becomes reactive instead of predictable. But your behavior introduced a new pattern. When they engaged, you responded calmly. When they withdrew, you did not collapse or escalate. When there was connection, you did not overextend. When there was space, you did not punish. That creates something psychologically powerful. Behavioral neutrality with emotional presence. And neutrality is what allows trust to form in avoidant systems. Not intensity, not pursuit, not emotional volatility disguised as passion, but steady, non-intrusive presence. Because deep down, avoidant individuals are not afraid of love itself. They are afraid of losing themselves inside it. So when they experience consistency without control, something begins to shift internally. The relationship no longer feels like a system they have to defend against. It starts to feel like a space they can enter and exit without emotional consequence. And that is the key difference, control says. If you move, I react. Consistency without control says, I remain steady regardless of your movement. One creates pressure, the other creates safety. But there is another layer here that is even more important.
Yeah.
Because you were no longer managing outcomes. You were no longer trying to regulate their emotional state. You were no longer attempting to engineer closeness through behavioral adjustment. You were simply showing up as yourself without negotiation. And that is where emotional strength becomes visible. Not in how tightly you hold on, but in how calmly you allow connection to exist without forcing it into a shape that feels secure for your anxiety. And this is where most people miss the deeper lesson, because consistency without control is not just a relationship strategy, it is a philosophy of self-possession. It is the ability to remain emotionally available without becoming emotionally invasive. It is the discipline of staying connected without losing sovereignty. And that is deeply attractive to an avoidant system because it removes the two things they unconsciously fear most: pressure and engulfment. So instead of feeling managed, they begin to feel met. Instead of feeling cornered, they begin to feel safe. Instead of feeling obligated, they be. The jinn to feel invited. An invitation is very different from demand. Demand triggers resistance. Invitation creates choice. And choice is where real emotional movement begins. You were consistent without being controlling. And in that balance, you did something most people never managed to do in these dynamics. You created stability without sacrifice and connection without captivity. And that is the kind of presence that doesn't just attract attention, it earns trust at the deepest level. Now let's move into something that most people completely underestimate in these dynamics. You saw their distance without making them the villain. And this one shift, this internal stance, is often the difference between escalation and emotional evolution in a relationship with an avoidant. Because when someone pulls away, the mind naturally wants to assign meaning. It wants a story that explains the discomfort. And most of the time that story becomes emotional judgment. They don't care, they're selfish, they're toxic, they're playing games. But what that interpretation really does is simplify complexity into blame. And blame might feel emotionally satisfying in the moment, but it destroys PS. A psychological understanding. It turns behavior into identity. It turns fear into accusation. And once that happens, the nervous system doesn't move toward curiosity, it moves toward defense. But you didn't do that. You didn't collapse their behavior into a villain narrative. You saw their distance, but you didn't reduce them to it. And that is a very rare level of emotional maturity, especially when attachment is activated. Because let's be honest, when someone you care about becomes inconsistent, distant, or emotionally unavailable, it is extremely easy to personalize it. It feels personal. It feels intentional. It feels like rejection. And in that emotional state, perception becomes narrow. You stop seeing behavior as a pattern and start seeing it as a verdict. But you resisted that narrowing. You allowed space for a different interpretation, not an excuse, but an understanding. And that distinction matters deeply because understanding says there is something happening beneath this behavior that is not about me alone. Blame says, this is who they are and this is what I deserve. One keeps the nervous system open, the other closes it. Now, from a psychological standpoint, avoidant, the RIA behavior is often misread because it doesn't follow the typical emotional expression of connection. It can look like withdrawal, detachment, or even emotional absence. But underneath that surface is often emotional processing that is happening internally rather than externally. And when someone meets that behavior with judgment, it confirms the avoidant's deepest internal fear. That closeness leads to being misunderstood or emotionally labeled. But when they are met with understanding instead of condemnation, something subtle shifts. Not immediately, not dramatically, but internally. Because now their distance is not being weaponized against them. It is not being turned into an accusation. It is not being used to define their entire emotional character. It is being observed without distortion. And that creates psychological safety. But here is the deeper layer that most people miss. When you didn't make them the villain, you also protected your own emotional clarity. Because villain narratives don't just damage the other person, they distort your own perception. They turn a complex human being into a simplified emotional target. And in doing so, they lock you into reactive thinking. The 3 of G, you stop asking, what is happening here? And start saying, how do I respond to this person? And that shift removes depth from the interaction, but you stayed in depth. You held the complexity. You allowed the possibility that distance is not always rejection, that withdrawal is not always abandonment, that inconsistency is not always malice. And that kind of thinking requires emotional discipline because it is easier to be certain than to be accurate. Certainty says, I know exactly what this means. Accuracy says, I am willing to stay open to what this means. And openness is where emotional intelligence lives. Now here's what this did in the relational dynamic. By not turning them into a villain, you removed their need to defend themselves from your interpretation. You lowered emotional defensiveness. You created space for reflection instead of reaction. And you prevented the escalation that often comes when both sides start reacting to imagined intentions rather than actual behavior. But just as importantly, you preserved something in yourself, dignity in perception. You didn't need to distort them in order to justify your feelings. You didn't need to reduce them in order. To protect yourself, you didn't need to rewrite their character to validate your experience. You could feel pain without creating distortion. And that is emotional strength at a very high level. Because when you can see someone's distance without turning it into their identity, you stay in reality instead of reaction. And reality is the only place where real connection can eventually be rebuilt. So you saw their distance, but you didn't turn it into a story of who they are. And in that space between observation and judgment, you kept the door open not just for them to return, but for you to remain grounded in truth instead of emotional distortion. And that is what separates emotional maturity from emotional reaction, the ability to see clearly even when it would be easier to condemn. Now we arrive at the final shift. And in many ways, this is the one that quietly determines everything that came before it. You didn't beg for love, you embodied it. And that is not a poetic phrase. It's a psychological reorientation of your entire relational posture. Because begging for love doesn't always look desperate on the surface. Sometimes it looks like over-explaining. Sometimes it looks like 3 of key over-giving. Sometimes it looks like trying to prove your value through emotional effort, consistency, availability, or sacrifice. But at its core, begging is always the same thing. It is the belief that love must be earned through persistence rather than recognized through presence. And you moved out of that entirely. You stopped trying to convince them. You stopped trying to secure certainty through emotional performance. You stopped adjusting yourself into versions that would be easier to keep. Instead, something fundamental shifted in you. You began to embody the very thing you were seeking, love. Not in the romanticized sense, but in the grounded psychological sense. Self-respect, emotional stability, boundaries without hostility, warmth without dependency, presence without collapse. And here is where things become interesting from an attachment perspective. Avoidant individuals are not drawn to emotional intensity that demands resolution. They are not moved by urgency that requires immediate reassurance. What actually captures their attention, what disrupts their internal expectation is emotional sovereignty. Someone who does not abandon themselves in pursuit of connection. Because when someone embodies love instead of pursuing it, the entire relational dynamic changes shape. There is no longer a pursuer and a distancer in the traditional sense. There is simply someone who is available and someone who is observing that availability without pressure. And observation is where avoided curiosity begins. But let's go deeper than behavior. When you stop begging for love, something internal collapses and something else is rebuilt in its place. What collapses is the illusion that your worth is being decided in real time by another person's response. What is rebuilt is the recognition that your value is not conditional on participation. And that shift is felt in your entire presence. Your tone changes. Your energy changes. Your timing changes. Even your silence changes. Because now you are no longer communicating from need, you are communicating from wholeness. And wholeness has a different emotional impact. It doesn't demand. It doesn't chase. It doesn't negotiate its existence. It simply is. Now here's what happens in the avoidant nervous system when it encounters this. At first there is often confusion because they are used to relational dynamics where 3 emotional intensity equals interest and withdrawal equals disinterest or conflict. But now they are encountering something different. Emotional consistency without dependency. You are not pulling them closer out of fear of losing them. You are not pushing them away out of fear of needing them. You are simply standing in your own emotional center. And that creates a recalibration in how they perceive connection. Because now being with you does not require them to manage your emotional state. It does not require them to protect themselves from being overwhelmed by need. It does not require them to anticipate emotional consequences for taking space. Instead, they encounter something unfamiliar. A relationship where love is not a transaction of anxiety. And that is rare enough to create attention. But more importantly, it creates respect. Not forced respect. Not performative respect. But the kind that emerges when someone realizes they are dealing with a person who does not need to lose themselves in order to be close. And here is the philosophical layer underneath all of this. When you embody love instead of chasing it, you are no longer trying to extract validation from someone else. Ease emotional availability. You are becoming the source of your own emotional alignment. And that fundamentally changes the type of relationships you attract and sustain. Because people don't stay where they are chased. They stay where they feel they can be themselves without being consumed or controlled. But there is something even deeper happening. When you stop begging for love, you remove the emotional leverage that uncertainty once had over you. You are no longer being manipulated by silence, distance, or inconsistency. You are no longer interpreting emotional gaps as personal inadequacy. You are no longer negotiating your worth based on fluctuating attention. You are anchored, and that anchoring changes everything. Because now, even if they leave, you do not collapse into self-abandonment. And even if they return, you do not rise into emotional dependency. You remain centered. And that is the highest form of emotional independence in relational dynamics like this. So when you embodied love instead of begging for it, you did something far more powerful than changing how they saw you. You changed what love meant in your own nervous system. It was no longer something you had to earn through pursuit. It became something you expressed through presence. And presence, real, grounded, self-contained presence, is what creates the possibility of love that does not come from fear, but from choice. And that is the final shift most people never reach. You didn't beg for love. You embodied it. And in doing so, you stopped asking to be chosen and became someone who was experienced as a choice worth making. So when you look at all of this together, you start to see the real pattern, not the surface story of avoidance pulling away, but the deeper psychological truth about what actually changes attraction at this level. It was never about you chasing harder. It was never about you proving more. It was never about you becoming louder in your need. It was about you becoming stable in your presence. You didn't chase their distance, you respected it. And in that respect, you stopped turning uncertainty into panic. You stayed regulated when they went cold. And in that regulation, you proved something most people never do under emotional pressure. You didn't abandon yourself to keep someone else close. You maintained your own life, and in doing so, you became someone who adds to a world rather than someone who revolves around a single connection. That kind of internal structure is rare, and rarity changes perception. You were consistent without being controlling, and that created safety without suffocation. You didn't turn love into rules, you turned it into reliability. You saw their distance without making them the villain, and that preserves something crucial. Your ability to understand without distorting, to feel without collapsing into judgment, and to stay connected to truth instead of reaction. And finally, you stopped begging for love and started embodying it. You stopped performing worthiness and started living from it. You stopped trying to earn something that was never meant to be chased and instead became the kind of presence that naturally stands on its own. And when all of that comes together, something very simple but very powerful emerges. The dynamic shifts, not because you forced it, but because you are no longer operating from lack. And here's the real takeaway that ties everything together. People don't come back because you convince them. They come back because in your absence of need and your presence of self-respect, they finally experience something different, something steady enough to trust, grounded enough to feel, and whole enough not to fear. But even beyond whether they return or not, something more important has already happened. You are no longer available to relationships that require you to abandon yourself in order to be chosen. And that is the real transformation. Because once you become that person, you don't just change who can love you, you change what love is allowed to cost you. And from that moment on, you don't chase connection anymore. You attract it from alignment. And that is where everything finally begins to shift for good.